fortunate to have back actually Zeynep Tufekci, who's on the faculty at University of North Carolina. She's also a guest columnist at times for the New York Times. You may have read some of her columns there and elsewhere. She's also a former CITP fellow and also faculty associate at the Berkman Center. So, and I think I have her old office.
You do.
So
check your water.
Yes. So today Zeynep is going to talk to us about the role of digital technology in various social movements. So please take it away.
Right. Thank you. So, as he said, I used to be here at CITP for a year, and that office was the favorite office of mine ever. So I totally don't blame you for wanting that. It's the best. So what I work on is I look at the role of technology in various social processes, and I'm going to talk mostly about social movements and technology and how they're interacting. This is a very long research project, also a personal interest for me. I grew up in Turkey. When I was a kid, the military regime was still strong and powerful, so we had a very controlled public sphere. We only got to watch American soap operas, basically, no news. I know everything about Little House on the Prairie. Though it made no sense in Turkey. I couldn't figure out where they were or what they were doing. The frontier doesn't exist when you come from that my part of the world. So when the internet came, I was among the first people to get on the internet in Turkey, and I'm a former programmer. And because of that, very early on, and I started working very early due to family circumstances. So I've been working professionally since I was a teenager as a programmer. So I had insight into internet before the internet was in Turkey, because I was working for IBM, which had an intranet. So all of a sudden I could connect to people around the world, even though I couldn't turn on the news and figure out what was happening in the southeast part of Turkey, right? So I knew this was going to be a major change. So as soon as the internet came, I went online, and I was very interested in social movements and social change. So I started just meeting people online and going to places. I traveled to Chiapas, Mexico, to look into whether the Zapatistas were indeed using the internet and how. And I've met people that I'm still in touch with, which is amazing enough. And then I followed this through observing the movements like the Seattle protests that were a big deal and that were organized partially online. And then the Arab Spring, Arab uprisings, and the wave of protests since 2010 or so hit. And I was just at that intersection, and one of the countries impacted was Turkey, my home country. So I'm going to talk mostly about Turkey examples with a little bit of Egypt examples. Because of time, I obviously cannot go through every detail, but this is a very, this is my forthcoming book. It's a 2-decade-long multi-country study, observation, all of that. So that's the preamble. So I do multi-method. I look at big data sets. I go do a lot of interviews. I get tear gassed in protests. I mean, I do all of the things. And the way I look at this is just, I say this because it's so obvious. It's the virtual world has been a major problem, I think, in analytically understanding, sort of looking at these technologies as virtual or not real. And there's a lot of theories that come from that, like slacktivism, that I don't think are very solid, because that's just not the way it operates out in the world. So that's sort of, I don't use that language. I know not everybody who uses it means not real, but just the fact that the way I look at it is these technologies are changing the architecture of our world. So they're connecting things and people that weren't connected in ways that weren't possible. So this is kind of like my gear sometimes, tear gas mask and a recorder, and I'm out there in the field a lot doing interviews. This is Gezi Park interviews. I've been in Egypt, Tahrir Square. I've been to Tunisia. I've been to lots of other countries. Also, U.S. had movements like that, like Occupy and Black Lives Matter. So what I want to do, and this is my thesis, is that there's been a lot of talk that these technologies aren't very powerful in some ways, and I don't think that's true. I think they're very, very powerful in lots of ways. It's kind of hard not to see that, even growing up in going from a very closed public sphere to boom, this open public sphere, it's clear they've had a major impact. And I'm going to argue some of the ways in which they have strengthened social movements' power to do certain things have seemingly paradoxically contributed to major weaknesses that don't come from technology alone, because nothing in the world comes from technology alone, but there is a convergence of multi-decade long trends in social movements being made technologically possible. And I will explain what I mean. So let's sort of go through some of the power that we're talking about. The first one that I'm going to tell you guys very briefly, you might have heard of this, is this ridiculously easy group organization. It's pretty amazing if you ever try to organize anything the old-fashioned way. This is a website called We Are Khalid Said. This was the website, the Facebook page, that basically organized the January 25th uprising that we heard so much about in Tahrir. What happened was it was a Facebook page that had gathered from a few other Facebook pages, because at the time the regime didn't really understand Facebook, and Facebook is used in Egypt, in Turkey, lots of places. It's a happy place. It's where you see your cousins, or where your sister-in-law's whatever is sending you Candy Crush requests. It's seen as a benign place. But in a place like Egypt, where the public sphere was very close, it quickly became this convergence of people finding that they weren't alone in hating the government. In political science terms, that's called pluralistic ignorance, or revealing of private traits. Let's just say that you right now, this is a horrible example, but I do give it. Let's say you're bored out of your mind by now and you're thinking, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And let's say you're sitting smack in the middle. You're really not very likely to be rude and walk away, right? Humans are very collective social animals. We go along with other people. And a lot of authoritarian regimes use a combination of carrots, sticks, and our compliance to make us feel that we're isolated in our dissent. Facebook broke that in Egypt. All of a sudden people could see, because it's a very connected network too. In Egypt, the norm is to Facebook friend everybody. It's a very connected network. So people started seeing that their neighbors and their friends and their family members were joining these critical websites. And after the Tunisian spark, it created really a cascade. And the We Are Khalid Said page created this event called the Revolution, an Evite, where you could, for the first time in history, you could click, yes, I will join to a revolutionary Evite. And we're talking weeks of preparation maximum. This is pretty amazing to see this come to be. And what the importance of this is, you don't just click yes. Facebook shows you, look, your friend also is going, and look how many of your social network is going. There was really strength in numbers, because in cascades, the early behavior is very important. If they can isolate a small enough group and crush you, the cascade can be contained, but once it gets big enough, it can't. Now, to be sure, this is a picture I took in Tahrir Square during a protest. It's an ecology. The little red arrow is the Al Jazeera camera, and the bottom person is filming it, and this like Al Jazeera is beaming what social media is showing. So I do want to be clear, the protest media ecology is not just social media, but it's completely plugged into the old media. So this is an enormous power to be able to organize like this. I have seen this again and again, and I'm going to talk about it. And to be able to get your publicity out with so little infrastructure. I want to emphasize this way of doing things, which I'll come back to because it's going to play a major role in this boom-bust cycle puzzle, is also coming from the culture of protest. If you go back in the US to if you might have heard about it, the Port Huron statement that preceded the anti-war movement, the student movement in '68, it's all about participatory impulses. People want to be part of things, not necessarily hierarchical organizations with division of labor. That's sort of the current social movement ethos. The other thing, besides the publicity, the other thing that these technologies allow these movements to do is logistics and coordination in ways I could not have believed it had I not seen it with my own eyes kind of situation. So it feels like hype-ish. But I'll give you guys one example, an example called Tahrir Supplies from Egypt. So in November of 2011, during still the tumultuous year before the crackdown came, there was a large wave of protests in Mohammed Mahmoud Street, which is right off Tahrir Square, goes into the Ministry of Interior. Long, complicated story why that was happening, not relevant to this thing, but it was very big. It was the youth frustration boiling over and the Ministry of Interior taking advantage of it. And there were 36 or 37 people who died during these protests. So we're not talking something small, right? We're talking dozens of people dead. And during the protests, this is what they do in Egypt. Because it's high stakes and real clashes, they set up field hospitals that are manned and womaned by doctors, nurses, pharmacists, all sorts of people. But this creates a supply problem. Like, which has the doctors? Where should this, who needs extra sutures? Who needs more betadine? Who needs antibiotics? It's actually not a simple question to organize the logistics for 10 field hospitals in the middle of active and ongoing clashes when people are being killed. And there was a lot of Twitter confusion. People were asking for this, but it was a retweet from a day ago, and it was a mess. And then popped up this Twitter account saying, we're going to coordinate this. And they started kind of pinging people. Because of Twitter's infrastructure allows you to ping people that you're not already friends with. Like, unlike Facebook, it's not a directed graph. It's just you can go whichever way. So they were able to get some attention to this thing they had, which was, we're going to organize this. So I watched. That later turned out to be 4 youngsters, only one in Cairo. Organize using Google spreadsheets, messaging apps like WhatsApp or Viper, Skype, a lot of Twitter, but a lot of sort of these collaborative spreadsheets. They've organized every last field hospital down to the number of needles in the space of a day or so. I'm like, this is pretty amazing. So after the things calmed down, and they did it again in every protest. They just took over the whole logistics chain. So after this was over, I said, let's talk. I was one of the people they pinged early on because they were getting Twitter jailed too because they were tweeting a lot. So they weren't really very technically competent either, but they could do it. So after the things calmed down, I talked to their founder, who was a 21, I think, at the time, 22. He was not in Cairo. He was a pharmacy student, so he had a little bit of familiarity, but he was a student. So I asked him, what made you think you could do this? He's like, why not? I said, how long did it take you to decide to do this and then start? He said, 5 minutes to set up the first account. I said, do you know anything about logistics? Do you know why Napoleon couldn't succeed and Hitler, all the stories of history and, army? He's like, what? I said, do you have any precedent for what you think you're trying to do? He said, yes, cupcakes. I said, okay, this is crazy world. What cupcakes? So he had seen a cupcake store in Cairo manages inventory by pushing the cupcakes it had too much of and other things. So he thought, if a cupcake store can do this, I can organize 10 field hospitals. Why not? I said, okay, let me not tell you any more history. I have seen, this is one example. I can give you 10 more examples. Occupy organized global protests with 2 weeks heads up. In Turkey, Gezi protests, they organize with no heads up. This is incredible. This kind of sort of communication on the ground, now also being part of the movement arsenal, is a major historical shift. So the other thing these movements can do, and I'm still going on about the power part, right? What these movements do. This will come back to the cycle. The other thing these movements do is this amazing anti-censorship work. So this is if you know anything about the Turkish protests, this is like their iconic picture. In Turkey, mass media is increasingly controlled, convoluted story through corporations that are looking for favorable bids with the government, right? So it's not the government directly, but it's the government indirectly. The Gezi protests in Turkey in 2013 came out of nowhere. They came out of nowhere in the sense that there wasn't a single person expecting anything like that. There's a park that was slated to be razed. People kind of protested. They had protested before. It just became this tipping point for people. It was at a very central location. It became this tipping point for people coming together and expressing their outrage. It was However, that coming together did not happen because people heard of this on media, mass media, because this is what was happening in mass media. When the protests in the middle of Istanbul, Taksim Square, were so out of hand and big that CNN International was broadcasting live from Istanbul. CNN Turkey was showing a documentary on penguins, right? So the penguins became the symbol of penguin media, like just not showing. You couldn't get the news from mass media. Of course, people started immediately trying to lure CNN into by photoshopping penguins into, these are actual scenes that Turkish media just wasn't showing, except the penguins, of course. This is a typical day in Turkish Twitter. You see, you go to CNN Live, it's a soccer game, you go to on Twitter, people running away from tear gas. It spawned its memes, Occupy, Gezi, the Twitter bird and tear gas became very powerful. But what had happened with the mass media censorship was that before, the regime would censor because it meant you could isolate. For example, in Tunisia, 2009, 2 years before the Sidi Bouzid protest broke open the uprising, there was a major protest in a mining city, a little bit of south. And what the government did was the classic authoritarian playbook. You isolate it, you kick out the journalists, you surround the place, you don't let people come in and go, you wait, and you wait, and you wear people out. Like, this is the classic low-level censorship isolate thing. In Turkey, it wasn't working anymore. And there were all these sort of, this is an example of a group that I've been following called 140 Journalists. We have these citizen journalism intermediaries erupting that are doing this great job. We have mass media of its own kind. Censorship in the old way is no longer working. Now I'm saying in the old way because we're going to come to the new way. So we have these sentiments. Revolution will not be televised and it will be tweeted, right? This is a very common sentiment. So now we're coming to our puzzle. We have these protests. We have Occupy, which is very strong in the US and globally, right? We have the Turkey Gezi protests, we have Egyptian protests, we have, like, if you look at the empirical studies, sort of this bird's eye view, the number of protests globally has tripled in the past 10 years compared to the period before. There's this huge spike. But if you look at their policy impact and their trajectory, you're seeing a lot of protests being defeated. To be honest, my friends in Egypt, a lot of them are in jail right now. There's an authoritarian regime that came to power. Turkey, I don't know how much I need to say if you're following the news at all, but there's like even academics who signed a petition to their government calling for a different policy for the Kurdish Southeast. They're being jailed and they're being fired. I mean, and these are academics. They're not like a very powerful group in Turkey. So this is like, there's this, why hasn't these movements that have so much power in these tools, right? What is going on here in that they're having similar crashes. And again, I'm not going into the details, anybody who wants to talk to me afterwards, but there's a lot of similarities to their trajectory. This is what got me thinking, because when it was just Egypt, you start thinking, okay, you know, Egypt, it's still not a modern country fully. And then you see the European protests and you're like, okay, Europe always had this. And then you see Occupy, and then I kept creating ad hoc explanations, but I really think there's a pattern going on. A global pattern that's partly, it's not a coincidence, the protest culture is global too. So to understand this, we have to do one parenthesis. The protest culture is a prefigurative space, and I'll explain what that means. Prefigurative is a word they use to mean harking to a future utopia. I'm just using it because it's the word that's used in the scholarship, but you might just want to call it, why do they all have libraries? So this is one of the things I kept puzzling. If you look at the protests around the world, they keep setting up these very colorful libraries. Hong Kong, the Occupy Hong Kong, they had this amazing library set up. Occupy US, they had libraries. This is the Gezi one, and you know, it's very colorful, and it says marauder. The prime minister called them marauders, so everybody kept calling themselves that because why not just appropriate? So what is happening here? Why do they have these libraries everywhere? Because I'm just thinking, and I've been to these places, it's like, who's got time to read books? It's not much, and you're getting tear gas, and there's all this activity going on, and who's bringing these books, and what is it representing to these people? And sort of to look at it, these are sort of what the protest spaces look like. They are really joyful spaces. This is kind of hard to explain because a lot of social movement thinking has been influenced by the free rider theory in political science, which looks at protests as a cost. And if there's a cost to be paid, why not let other people pay it and free ride, right? And it makes sense beautifully mathematically, except people aren't seeing these protests as a cost to be paid. It has become a major space of self-expression for protesters around the world. And this is, again, a long political thing. It is because a lot of these people see ordinary politics and representational democracy and electoral politics as hopelessly corrupt. Now, there's so many, I know, people are like, really? Yes, obviously they have a point, right? They do see representation and social movement representation, especially as something that will be corrupted, co-opted, or killed, right? Your social movement leadership, if it exists, will either be, discarded somehow, or it'll be corrupted by the power, or it'll be co-opted by the power. So what these protests have evolved into is, and this comes all the way back again to the post-60 movements, is a very, very participatory culture in which the protest itself is part of what these people are seeking as a way of self-expression. The protest spaces, I mean, if you've not been to one of these, especially if you're getting occasionally tear gas but not live bullet fired at, that's no fun. But tear gas is this great coalescer of sentiment. It creates protesters out of passerbys. It's just annoying and awful enough to make you very angry, but it doesn't kill you, and you get experience with it. So what happens is these people are coming to these protests wanting to do things the ad hoc, participatory, on-the-fly way that the technology is allowing them to do, right? Before, if you wanted to do this protest in this ad hoc way and you wanted to say, let me organize 10 field hospitals and I have nothing else but like spray, well, you couldn't do it with clips, right? You couldn't do it with clipboards. You couldn't really express this participatory impulse and ad hoc impulse fully if you didn't have the tools allowing you to do things this way. This is a complete tech culture convergence. And it's a very global convergence. I mean, I also know this personally. I have met people I have seen, 15 years ago at protests around the world show up in Gezi Park just by coincidence because people are drawn to these things. I have walked into Tor developers in Cairo, as in I'm just walking around and I bump into someone and it's a bunch of Tor developers training the Egyptian activists. There's this enormous convergence of globalization from below. This is a picture I took in Istanbul, I think second or third day of the major protests. These are Roma ladies. They normally sell flowers to the tourists. As soon as the whole place was taken over by protests, there is no supply chain that's just in time, like the street peddlers in a third world country. They immediately stocked up on anonymous masks, sort of paint to spray whatever graffiti you were going to, goggles to protect your eyes. They were just ready right there with whatever you were going to buy, they were going to sell you. But the thing is, I could have taken the anonymous masks. I've seen them around the world. This is both personally, culturally, socially, there's an enormous resemblance in both tactics and what it means. Now, there's a huge sociology theory by Paul DiMaggio, who is a CITP affiliate, but I believe he's moved to NYU. He's moving, I think. But about this kind of cultural isomorphism of various institutions looking like each other, corporations doing things because other corporations do it this way. Social movements do the same thing too. They do what they see, and there's more and more seeing, partly because of this technology enabling you, and partly because we travel more. So there's this below. So let's come to the puzzles. Lack of policy impact proportional to size. You don't have, I mean, these are, I give my slides, but I just put them in words. I'll talk about them. Accessing information, I'm going to come to this, remains really hard despite censorship not being effective. And publicity is leading to polarization. So what are some of these are the puzzles I've been looking at. With all this power, why are we there? So clue one, these movements are unable to take tactical turns. What do I mean by this? See, if you're a social movement, right, you face an adversary. And if your culture and your technology and your movement participants are all about the ad hoc, participatory, horizontal, leaderless moment, for very understandable reasons, I'm not saying this to judge, I understand how this came to be. What it means is at the first tactical turn you need to take when the government is either negotiating with you or coming after you or there's some development, there's no formal or informal decision-making ability. Not only that, there is no culture of decision-making together. So you're coming into this really fast curve. You went from 0 to 100 miles in 2 days. Everything's great. You got 1 million people in the streets. And you need to negotiate something. You can't take the first curve. I've seen this in Egypt. I've seen this in Istanbul. I've seen everywhere. They keep wanting to do the same thing that first worked, partly because protest is so great. Occupy had huge fights. They just wanted to keep occupying places, even though as a tactical turn, it had kind of exhausted itself. If you look at successful movements in the past, you see tactical turns that come from decision-making ability as this crucial, powerful tool. If you look at the US Civil Rights Movement, there's another very famous sociology paper, the tactical turn-making and the Black insurgency, I believe, Doug McAdam. They talk about, at length, about, you do sit-ins and they kind of run their course and then you do something else and they run their course. The government comes at you, it runs its course. So this lack of decision-making. So this is a picture I took when the government finally tried to negotiate and co-opt the protests in Turkey. And what happened was, there's a sound stage, but there's no structure to make decisions. I don't mean this as online, offline, okay? The General Assembly is also, remember, it's coming from the culture too, right? The cultural way of doing things. And they couldn't respond to the government's negotiating points, which was then used as a way to say, well, we're going to raise it. I think in Hong Kong, the government learned to wait this process out. You can just wait this process out. If the movement cannot take a turn, you can wait. So this is kind of the decision-making process that I've seen. Like, again, this is not an online, offline problem. You've just got all these hands going up or down. This is great for coming together around the initial demands, hence the boom. You want to say no to something, you can do this very quickly. You can't take the next step. The second example I'm going to give you guys is, this is just sort of the censorship by information glut. I'm not talking about China or Iran, okay, so I want to be clear, this doesn't apply to every place, so where things are more severe, this doesn't work this way. But in Turkey, if you've got the slightest motivation to go online, you can. Yes, the government's doing a lot of things, but internet remains accessible, circumvention is widely practiced. People know about VPNs, people know about changing their DNS. I mean, it's a networked environment, and people also have used things like WhatsApp, in which there's some nodes that just get the information and spread. So it's not that you don't get information. What happens is, once again, because of lack of intermediaries, this horizontal organization that we're seeing, this blob of movements, it means you can't verify what's true or not. And what governments from Turkey to Russia and their social movement opponents, it could be government, it could be social movements opponents, have taken to doing is flooding social networks with claims of falsehood, it's Photoshop, it's not true. You see this a lot in Russia. You see this constant sort of, it's not true, it's not true, it's Photoshop, it's not true. You have a picture from southeast Turkey where there's been a lot of clashes, and there's this flood of tweets and Facebook saying, no, it's from Gaza, it's from Gaza. Now, occasionally, it's true somebody makes a mistake, but I want to give you, because this is an example of what happens. This is horrible. There was a claim that the government there was a multi-week full curfew in the Kurdish parts of Turkey. Internet was functioning. I knew people on the ground personally, so I had personal contacts. I could not tell what was true or not. And I have, 15 years of verifying information experience under my belt. And I know Turkey, I know people, and I could not, for the life of me, figure out whether some of the claims were true or not. started throwing up my hands and saying, this is horrible, let's get some international investigators in there maybe. I mean, it was this very sad situation, because what would happen is, so there would be a picture like that on the right, this claim that this was a child killed and they couldn't even go out to bury the child, so they were storing the body in a freezer. What you would see is this one says lie, true, this claim that it's actually from blah, blah, blah. Except, you know, it's not the same picture. You see, it's not even the same picture. They like, this is a picture of a body in a fridge, and they have another one saying this is lie, this is true. The problem is if you go on Turkish Twitter and say, you know, the name of the place, fridge, if you search, you see this one that's a wrong, they're debunking a wrong picture. Like they have a false claim, they're debunking. This seems like people can see through this, yes? Well, no, if it's a million of them, right? You really cannot tell what's true or what's not without very sort of trusted intermediaries telling you, I was there and I took this picture. So I will talk about, like, I'm not going to show you this one, but I'll come to this sort of this verification problem. And this was a major discussion we had at the Princeton CITP, the censorship thing, is that my feeling is that the current censorship outside of examples like, you know, China or Iran is less by blocking, more by flooding with bad information. And that requires a different tactical response than circumvention. We'll talk about that. So clue 3 is that these governments like Russia and Turkey have moved drastically to control mass media. Like, they can't control information, but they can control mass media. So what the current strategy is to create a demonization of the online world as a place of filth and ransomware and malware and smut and everything you don't want your kids to see. Have a very controlled mass media environment. Completely confuse the internet area by flooding it with bad information, which participatory movements are very bad at dealing with, because they want to give everyone a voice, but that means who knows what's going on. So a strategy of polarization and hegemony over mass media works fairly well. This is Egypt, this is Russia, this is Turkey, Hungary's trying. I can't believe I'm saying this, but yeah, you know, it's a very different world. So I've been using this metaphor for climbing to Mount Everest with the help of Sherpas to explain this. There's a lot of social movements. Like there's tons of people who can now climb Mount Everest who couldn't climb Sugarloaf Mountain, right? They're not mountaineers. They don't know what they're doing. What's happening is sometimes they're being choppered into base camp, which is the first camp, and then they have Sherpas carrying their stuff, and then they have Sherpas carrying oxygen for them. And I'm serious. Like there's a huge industry because people have it on their bucket list. What happens is you have a large number of people who end up in Mount Everest who have no business being above 8,000 feet, after which things get serious. Now, I started using this metaphor a couple years ago, and before all the horrific accidents in Everest had come through, so I may drop this because it seems too real. But it's exactly how it played out, is that as soon as a little thing goes wrong, since they're not mountaineers and since they're dependent on oxygen to be there, if they run out of oxygen, they're dead. You know, if there's a storm, they're dead. If there's anything, they don't know what to do. We keep seeing these mass casualty events. And this is crazy. This is the Hillary Tenzing step. This is the final step to Everest. I mean, all you need is a Starbucks on the corner. This is ridiculous. You can't have, you have 100 people trying to climb what is a very narrow place. And I bet you 90 of those people have not climbed a major mountain before. They've been pushed there. The weather's great and there are ropes. You'll be fine. Slightest hiccup, major casualty. I think a lot of social movements are like that. The internet is acting like they're Sherpa carrying their oxygen. They're not building infrastructure. So to sort of, I'm going to talk, this is my, like bringing it together. So to understand what this means, consider the 1963 March on Washington, the civil rights movement. Now, it was about 1 million people, maybe more. It's the one that Martin Luther King Jr. gave the famous I Have a Dream speech. Although it wasn't even the first time he gave that. And it made a major difference in the sense that in our history books, it's a turning point, fine. but look at what that march represented as capacity. Don't look at the march as 1 million people. Look at the march as a signal of underlying capacity. Starting with 1959 Montgomery bus boycotts, which they organized carpools for a year for people. I mean, they organized pencil and paper, meeting every day, carpools, so that people could get to work during the bus boycott in Montgomery. To like a decade of organizing really big protests, and the amount of repression and challenges they faced. Their sound system was sabotaged the day before. I mean, this was not an easy thing. By being able to pull off that march so well, what the movement had demonstrated was not that it had 1 million people. Of course it had 1 million people. It's signal. Like, think of signaling theory. It demonstrated it was a signal of underlying capacity that could do many, many, many other things. Now, fast forward, say, to 2004 February anti-war march in New York against the war in Iraq, right? George W. Bush, I was there. There was 1 million people. It was a large march. And George W. Bush, who was president at the time, looked at it and said, why should I listen to this focus group? I mean, at the time, I was insulted. We're here protesting. Why are you calling us a focus group? But over time, I thought about it. There's a point to it. What do these 1 million people represent as capacity, especially since it was organized very much online and very quickly? It turns out he was right. The March on Washington in 1963 does not represent the same capacity as, say, that anti-war march or the Occupy's global marches do. We keep making this mistake of looking at the number of people who showed up, rather than looking at what does this represent. So we have affordance, ridiculously easy coordination without organization. The strength, a movement can come out of nowhere and it can tap into pluralistic ignorance, which means you can reveal private preferences. The weakness, you can't take tactical turns because it comes without decision-making structure by design and by its momentum. I'll come to the tool policy answer. Affordance, you can have publicity without gatekeepers. You can change narrative. Occupy made inequality a conversation tactic. The weakness is this is very prone to polarization techniques if it's not coming along with other strategies, which I've talked about. In the US, you may or may not follow it, but there's a huge backlash around this, the maker, taker, whoever is the deserving, the lazy protester thing. Now, again, it's not as powerful as it should be, but it kind of, if you look at social media on not the left part of it, but the right part of it, this is a major animating thing. And you see this now in the Republican Party playing out very strongly, is that their polarization happens from this. Now, censorship busting tools, once again, censor and isolate no longer functions as an affordance of this. But lack of verification in intermediaries, the doubts that kind of arise, smother the interest in the movement. Ordinary people look at this and say, I can't tell what's going on. And at some point, you tune out, unless you're directly affected. Now, so this brings me back to, so what are the technologies, tools that we are? When you think about social movements and change, what are the technologies and tools? Now, a lot of these movements use existing commercial platforms like Twitter, Facebook, which there's a huge bunch of emergent issues that I've left out, like the algorithmic regulation of those tools now and more, because they're ad-supported spaces. They're not very great. They're not very good for social movement work, but they're also very good because everybody's there. What we don't have is technical tools that allow deliberation and decision-making that is in accordance with the that is in resonance with the cultural and political mood. I mean, you're not going to organize NGOs and get these people to vote, right? It's like, it's just not going to work because of where these movements are politically and culturally, globally. They want to be part of this process. They want to have a voice. It's the 21st century. But we don't have ways of decision-making that work at scale and that are deliberative, but result-oriented. There's a lot of efforts among the social movement community, the tech leg of it, that's looking at it. I don't see as much in the academic side, so this is one thing I want to say, is that I think there's a great space for trying to figure out how can we think together that gives people voice, but doesn't give them so much voice that it's just this flat cacophony. The polarization is a major challenge. Bridge building is a technocultural challenge. How do you create common agendas? How do you create this? I think goes back to the lack of intermediaries. How do you do this? Again, there's a lot of things that people have been playing around with, trying to think, how do we do this? And I think there is a role for developing technologies that enable this, because once again, because of where these movements are, there's now appetite for trying to solve these problems. 10 years ago, if you went and told these people, let's do this, you probably wouldn't have had the same take up, but now that we've been through a boom-bust cycle. And finally, because of the censorship, busting tools, they do work, and circumvention mostly works. What we need is verification and identity affirmation tools. I mean, most of the time, people think of social movements and they think, oh, they need encryption. Well, if you're a whistleblower, you do. But if you're a social movement trying to organize, most of what you're doing is trying to get more publicity to you and grow your network. If you're trying to grow your network is as strong as the weakest link. You're going to be infiltrated. So there's usually an assumption. What they do need is encryption for is keeping their interpersonal stuff private, because governments use that to blackmail them. Right? I've seen this again and again. Or they use them to say, if you don't do this, we'll embarrass your mom. I'm not kidding. Right? This is kind of a more essential technique. So what a lot of movements need is a way to say, this photograph was taken on or after this moment. It's not from Gaza. It's from Southeast Turkey, something like that. I've been talking to techie people. Let's take the snapshot of the New York Times and cryptographically use it as a signature to verify that a picture wasn't taken before or after. Let's create some secure system which can affirm things like that. I mean, there's obviously a lot of technical problems here, because we're talking about verifying the metadata. And obviously, doubts can be cast about anything that's digital. But there has to be ways we can do this better. Because I talk to movement people around the world, and this is like a #1 thing. And when you talk to them, they don't come and say, can I have more Tor? They probably know about it anyway. They'll come and say, is there a way for me to verify that I took this picture on this particular date? And to verify, they don't want to hide the metadata. They want to sign the metadata. It's kind of funny. So the longer lesson is, the powerful actors learn. They learn to neutralize. They learn to attack. They learn to demonize. And the movements have not really responded. So I'll end on the funny note and open up to questions. This became the symbol of the Turkish. I have a poster of this. This is the penguin throwing flowers. And you can sort of see the hashtag means resist. That became like the big hashtag. The fact that these movements are kind of named by hashtags is very telling how central. Like Twitter was like the capillary of the movement in Gezi when I was there. It was very important. It was like the nervous system of the whole thing. But, as cute as this penguin is, social movement work has this capacity signaling problem that I think is very ripe for the movements. When I talk to people, there's more and more recognition of these things. And my question to the techie people around is like, what kind of tools can we bring to the table to help with these problems that aren't always on our agenda? So thank you, and I will take questions, comments, and should I just, yeah.
So I thought it was very interesting, very enlightening. But I was curious as to why you didn't talk about the leaders or the originators of these social movements. Maybe their motivation or their aptitudes, because you talked about these social movements not taking tactical turns. But what about the leaders? I mean, what about their motivation, their aptitudes, their political acumen, and so on?
So, I mean, sort of time limits. The leadership issue is really complex. I did write one article about this kind of attention economy, leaderlessness. What happens is a lot of these movements have de facto spokespeople, people who get a lot of attention, but it's not through any formal mechanism. So they're not actually recognized as leader of anything in the sense that there's a lot of, it comes with a lot of contention. So they'll have a lot of legitimacy and recognition from some groups of people, but there'll also be lots of challenges with no way of resolving who actually gets to speak. So just one sec, in the Egyptian example, for example, there was this huge, bitter fight over who got to speak for the movement because there's no way to resolve it. I saw this in Gezi. I'm seeing this now in Black Lives Matter. There's these internal fights over who gets to speak for the movement or not. So I'm not saying there are no leaders in the sense that there are people who emerge, but I'm saying since there's no formal mechanism or an informal mechanism to say these are the people who are sort of on the leadership position able to make decisions, that we delegate some decision-making authority to them, even when they make decisions, it often leads to very polarized responses and no way to resolve it.
When I followed the Egyptian resolve, and it seemed to me that what
right.
was
So Wael's the friend, actually. I just talked to him yesterday, and we have an interview with him coming out in the next issue of Tech Review where he talks exactly about this. There was so much polarization around him, he went off Twitter for 1.5 years. There were hashtags, unfollow, there was so much. And he told me this. He said, I didn't feel bad when the military came after me. It was when the movement turned against me, because there was this polarization about supporters. He said that just crushed him. And he didn't, it's not like he wanted to be a leader. He just came to be that position. And there was no way for him to resolve it by saying, look, I'm not the leader, I'm just a person, because he kept getting all the attention and hatred. It led to him going off online for a while. It led him to, well, he's in exile now. And he's also now developing a tool called Parleo, where he's trying to create more civil discussion. So it's exactly that experience of polarization that I'm talking about that has brought him to this position. Yes, he was, but that's how it played out over the next few years. Yes? Great question. So I've done a couple of things. I've been following the Trump social media informally. I wish I'd done a more systematic study. I have a list of them, and I've been following. Every morning I wake up and I look at what they're up to for the past maybe 6-7 months at least. And I had been saying that Trump was viable since summer because of the Republican Party dynamics, right? There's this crisis of representation. So what I've seen is, and I went to Trump rallies. I was like, all right, I'm just going to go see how it is. Just don't tell people I'm from the country they want to deport everybody from. I look white, so it kind of passes. Anyway, so what I found was they live in an alternate universe fact-wise. It's crazy. I mean, and yes, the Republican leadership started this. You can blame them all you want, and I do. But Trump supporters, Trump was talking about these blah, 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 and at one point he said Congress funds ISIS. And I was like, what? What did he just say? And I thought maybe so rambly he misspoke, and the crowd just didn't, they just shrugged. And then I went and checked, they believe, I find this all the time, and I'm not talking marginal accounts, although I follow a range. I follow marginal accounts, I follow large accounts. They believe that, I am not kidding, that the Republican-controlled Congress has been funding ISIS. Now, this is a bit like the anti-vaccination movement in some ways, right? Trump occasionally, like in the rally I was, out of the blue, he said, and this was in a military town, he said the military companies, corporations, sell crap to the, I'm paraphrasing, crap to the US government because they have political influence. We should make our country great and our military great, but we shouldn't buy crap because these companies are influencing the people that are running for president. Now, this is an obvious truth, and it doesn't have a political constituency in the sense that the Republicans wouldn't say this and the Democrats don't usually come out saying more military. The crowd jumped to its feet. People were talking about that line after it was over, saying, can you believe he said this? Nobody says this. So there's this fascinating mix of an unrepresented constituency for whom, yes, trade deals aren't great for everyone. I mean, this is like, did it really take Trump for us to figure this out? There's a lot of problems. That is fueled into racial resentment politics, which is a long tradition in this country, which is mixed with absolute falsehoods. So people have been blaming media. I'm going to write a column about this. I think Trump is a sign of media weakness. I mean, nobody's going to be, the people I'm following are not going to be swayed by a critical interview on a Sunday show. They do not, if they can believe that the Republican Party is funding ISIS, right? If this is a common enough belief, what can you do? So you've got this lack of ground truth. And this is a multi-decade process, goes back to cable TV, goes back to other cultural things. I think that's allowing somebody as Trump, of course it corresponds to a crisis of political representation for a particular segment of the country and all of that. But I think that's kind of how it fits into what I see with Trump from my social media and personal observations. I have so much more thoughts on it. I'll just leave it there. I think it's a fascinating example. Yeah.
I absolutely love your talk, and I look forward to talking to you later. But I want to tie in what you were just talking about to something that you asked about earlier. You were talking about this costly signaling theory about going out and doing these protests.
Right.
And you said, well, actually, they're having fun. Well, okay, that's a lot of biology is like that. Sex is like that, right? You have fun, but it's actually super costly and very dangerous for women, right?
Right.
Reproduction.
Right.
So one of the things that I think is happening right now is polarization. And one of the ways that you can show which in-group or out-group you're on is by your beliefs.
Absolutely.
And so I suspect if you want to find another time when it was like this, you can look at the last time it was this polarized, which is just before and after World War I is the last peak of polarization. I bet you would find the same level of just
signaling,
crazy theory.
Right.
Well,
it's mass participation too.
Yeah, we're emotionally, we're offended. I used to be thinking, like, what are the Republicans doing on Sunday night TV or whatever? They're signaling how strong they are by what ridiculous things they can say. But that I realized, no, everybody is doing this, and they're just doing it to check. Right. Do you really like me? Because can I say something insane, and will you agree?
So I think like the same political process that allows Egyptian activists to find each other and draw strength from, even though they're a minority, also allows anti-vaccination people to find each other and draw strength from each other. So homophily and polarization are two sides of the same coin. If you have homophily processes, you have polarization processes, unless you have something really strong countervailing. And I think mid-20th century, we had the centralized mass media that kind of countervailed, and that's unraveling. So we're kind of almost back to the homophily and polarization playing off each other. So I think, and yes, I definitely use sort of the biological signaling theory on a there's a whole, I will look at it. I mean, I have a big chunk of signaling theory is not used enough in social movement theory. That's my sociology gripe here. But I think it's very appropriate for understanding why movements threaten power when they manage to. I would love to talk. Yes. Sure. So, for example, in Egypt, after the initial Tahrir Square protests succeeded in ousting the Mubarak, it became fairly clear that the military was moving into muscle into power again. Like they had never really totally left. And what the movement people kept wanting to do was to go back to Tahrir and occupy the place. Like the push, there were people trying to push for electoral participation, other tactics. I watched this, and I watched this in real time, and I talked to lots of my friends. I really don't want to sound like I'm blaming them, because they faced great repression, and they had no civil society infrastructure coming out of great repression. But they were also unable to tactically commit to any other path but re-Tahriring. I've seen this in Gezi. They want to go back and occupy the park. It goes back to why that park was a great place, and also lack of decision making. I think movements are kind of have learned. So I think there's movement away from this. Bernie Sanders is an Occupy offshoot. I'm sorry, they found a candidate and they're running with it, right? So that's a wing. Podemos is a wing that broke off from the Indignados movement and is running electorally. So we're seeing these tactical shifts, but they're still not happening in. They're just happening because people have decided we're just going to do it anyway, and they're kind of floundering a little bit because of their nature, rather than this more meta thinking, which is how do we take tactical turns. So that's sure.
It's much clearer, but because I was a little bit concerned that if we expect it might make it too high standard for social movement groups because I think the social movement has its own value as it puts some pressure and power. Like in your example, they set the agenda that
Right.
the media, mainstream media didn't
Right.
do.
Right.
If we look at like the American politics, like the history of American politics, and the social movement groups are becoming more institutionalized, and they adopt this tactical
Yes.
things like from interest to groups, but that's not necessarily a good thing.
Right. So I would say that the tactical turn doesn't have to be institutionalization. It may include institutionalization. I mean, there all this. That's what they fear. They fear the co-option that may come from. So, but there could be many other tactical turns: insurgent campaigns, primary challenges. I mean, you can think of the Occupy Debt movement. So there have been attempts, and so I'm not. And I don't think the old institutionalization path would even attract too many people, to be honest, and not necessarily for the bad reasons. I know we're running out of time. I think if you need to leave, you can leave. But if you have questions, I'll take them. Is that fair?
We'll end the formal part.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll end the formal part, but I'll keep taking questions because people had their hand up, and then yeah, right. So you had a question?